Hi, I'm Patrick Lemon, and this is episode 2 of Making a Criteria for a Good Puzzle Game. In this episode, I'll be reading through my notes on actually starting to make the game itself. Before you watch this video, you can actually play the test build, and therefore give me feedback about the first levels of the game. If you can record yourself playing too, that would be super cool, and you can just send it over to me. So firstly, I sat down and actually designed the mechanics, and wrote down my ideas. I'll go through this first, before getting on to the designing the levels and other things. So let's jump right in. Designing the machine. I started by drawing some abstract shapes. This helps me keep the game away from being designed from a theme. I quickly decided it would be turn-based, grid-based, and use shapes so I could avoid being weighed down by theming. I thought about moving things around and moving components on a grid. I decided on having a player piece that occupies one grid tile. I didn't realise at the time, but I think it seems like such a good idea because I knew people could relate to it and would instantly make sense to them. I also followed the single focus point criteria I gave myself and made sure the player always knew what they were able to do and move and where on the screen they were and what they were doing. I like the idea of switching places with an object. I also like the idea of matching tiles. I made a few sketches where pieces of one colour can't be surrounded by the other colour. One white piece in the middle of two circles would need to be moved to solve the puzzle. I played around with this and thought about matching pieces up, and also you have to sort all the shapes into twos on the board. They would also not be able to sit next to a tile of another type. I drew out the permutations of this, and it was too small and not very fun either. I wrote, "The problem is the machine is not interesting enough. The pebbles need another form of interaction past not being able to sit next to each other. What about one stone cannot be next to more than one other colour connected, but must be next to at least one of the same colour?" I then drew sketches explaining this. This started to feel nice, particularly because the game had a large amount of permutations of success states. Even on a 3x3 grid, I usually work from a 3x3 grid when designing to try and keep things minimalist and simple, there was a large amount of variation here. Just after that, according to my notes, I also realised it would need some way of ending the levels. Originally, I had thought it would work something like Sudoku or crossword, where you know by finishing it that you've solved it. However, this wouldn't work because there's always free space, unlike crosswords, where you would need to fill it all up. I also hate the idea of the player just uselessly moving around the puzzle till the game tells them that they did it. I want the player to form plans in their head and attempt to execute them, then work from the feedback of what happened. I made one of the tiles an end of the level check my solution tile, and thought that worked nicely. It's also cool because it adds to the game that you cannot walk over it till you've done, and that means there's some fun of avoiding the square later in the game. I stuck with it. Second, I'm going through my design process from when I sat down to actually started making the levels of the game. On a side note, I decided to code the engine the day before so that I could make the levels without thinking about the code and their function, and focus on the actual quality as levels. This worked well, and I'll do this again in the future. Designing the windows into the machine. So, I'm going to go through the notes I took during the process and talk about it as I go, quoting myself and talking about the design. To begin, I quickly decided that although I had designed the mechanics that would be in the first areas of the game, when I designed on paper, that was just to test it was a good mechanic and could be spread and explored in different ways. When I sat down to make the levels, the first thing I decided to do was only use the original moving mechanic for the first section of the game. I quickly realised I needed a limited play space and proceeded to make walls that the player couldn't walk through. This was an important way of opposing the main mechanic, and I had completely overlooked this when designing on paper. In fact, when I designed on paper, as you can see, I only threw together rough ideas of levels, as I knew I couldn't play them out properly in my head. It needed to be played properly in the game. The next thing is the flaw with my original criteria. As written by Bucky on the Dinofarm forums, which I'll link below, the player's thoughts and thought process are a big part of the puzzle design. I will now quote from Bucky. "Discover. The player tries something to see what happens. The result of successful discovery is building a better mental model of the puzzle's rules. Plan. The player manipulates their mental model in search of a solution. This may involve breaking the puzzle down into sub-puzzles or coming up with new things to try. Execute. The player tries to translate their plan back into the game." End quote. The note I made when designing, which relates to that, was: what do puzzles allow and not allow you to do? What does the player quickly learn and presume they are able to do? What's important is that interesting windows into the machine that I'm trying to make skips over the part of who is viewing into the machine. This might sound obvious, but I was caught up in making things interesting for me and people like me that I didn't think about what would actually be thinking during the process of exploring and breaking down the puzzle. Instead, I was concerned whether the puzzle as a whole was interesting, which is useful for thinking of the game in broad sense, but not thinking about the specifics. How does the player quantify the rules in their head? This is something that started becoming important. Even though I had written down the mechanics and the rules and the restrictions, the player's exploration didn't have to lead them straight there. I realised I could play around with someone's expectations. For example, suggesting through the level design that pips have to be in pairs, when in fact they can be in any amount as long as they are connected. Suggesting that all pips must be frozen for the level to be solved. I like this as those jokes of understanding that I talked about before. It's a communication between the developer and the player, using the level to be like, hey, you totally jumped to this conclusion, and that's exactly what you're supposed to do, just like the setup for many jokes in real life. With so few rules, it actually involves a slightly higher amount of content per map to make the game interesting. I started to find the challenge of crafting simple yet interesting puzzles with such a small mechanic difficult about 25 minutes in. I wrote, making sure the puzzles link to the next one. The first puzzles will be about introducing mechanics. The next one will be about changing your perception of what is actually happening. The last ones will be challenging variation on the section, maybe not even challenging. I talked about this in my criteria, and about half an hour into this, it really came into play. After experimenting with the level design, I started using the design of previous levels to influence the player's perception of the next level. It becomes clear that you have to be very careful about what and where you put the stuff in each level. For example, I decided to make sure the finish tile was in the same corner for many of the first levels, creating consistency to be broken at the right time for the player. Later, when designing more and more levels, even though I was only exploring one mechanic, I had to be careful to not introduce more than one thing to each level. For example, moving the finishing tile and introducing that you don't have to freeze all the pips to win. Another thought is that the theme will greatly help with this problem. By changing the area of the puzzles, like in Steven's sausage roll, you can communicate to the player that the mechanic we are focusing on and playing around with is changing. I've taken a mental note and will introduce my theme way before I was intending to. The original idea was that I did art and theming as the very last thing to make the game more accessible. Now, however, I realise it will have to play a part in the design of the levels and how the player will be interacting with the actual ideas themselves. Without this mindful analysis of what I'm doing, I don't think I would have realised this till much later. The walls and floor are clearly not part of the puzzles. I will not be playing with the player's perception of these. I think people have a really good natural feeling for this. For example, having invisible keys that the player didn't know existed to unlock a door is bad design. In the same way, I make an agreement with the player that I will play with their intelligence and the ideas in the game. This means the rules and their interactions only. I laid down that messing with the walls and other necessary but unimportant objects would take the focus away from what I was considered to be important when I designed it. I also think that the walls are like the opposite of the player moving, and give necessary restrictions to the puzzles. They serve a clear purpose, and I don't want to add complexity to the wrong parts of the game. Realise that the first two puzzles actually taught you too much about how the game worked. They meant I couldn't surprise the player on level 3 with the fact that not all blocks need to be turned to ice to win. This one is really specific, but I had to go back and change levels when I realised they introduced too many mechanics and spoilt the fun. Next, I realised how hard it was for me to know how understandable the first level is. I need to play this already with people because it relies on the communication between the player and the game. Next, in response to the last one, I made it so you can't go wrong. The only way to go wrong is to walk over the solution button too early. I kinda like this because it suggests that there is a puzzle here, makes the player not feel like the game is way too simple and easy on the first level, and it also sets the idea up of doing things in the right order, really early on, which, as I've come to realise, is the reason for it. Next, decided it would be cool if this was an entirely visual game, so change the F on the finish thing as finish tile, and adding a level 0 where you have to press the arrow keys to exit. This is funny too because It sets up the idea of not being able to progress till you have done the puzzle by using the tutorial as, look, you just do this thing. And keeping all the finishes in the same corner for the first puzzles, trying to find ways like this to set up expectation. Actually trying really hard to make this more about the levels and less about the levels representing the puzzles. The more I can do with the physical space, the space the player will actually be looking at, the better. Keep it simple, but make them see patterns, i.e. the finish being in the corner. This isn't where I playtested, but it makes more sense to bring it up here. The game was in a slightly rougher state than the one you've just played. The player had to manually move through the levels when they were told that they had completed it. The playtester had a huge problem with the lack of the tutorial. The playtester, I could only find one person to play so far, actually wouldn't play through the whole game because they were so frustrated by not 100% understanding what was happening and what the actual rules were. They did, however, when I talked to them afterwards, have a good guess at what was happening. I think this was a more extreme reaction to a problem people might have. It shows that to me, someone who recently played a lot of hard puzzle games, that it would be fun for someone to try and work this stuff out, because I knew it would be fun for me. This is obviously bad, and I need to be more careful of this in the future. I'm not sure where I'm going to go from this, and I'll make more decisions about this before the next video and talk about them then. Notes from the final part of the level design process. I made these notes a little more straightforward, so here I will just read them through as they are. After playing around and making 10 levels, I have learnt a lot. This is where I export the first build also. At this point I'm a little dubious of how good the idea is, but I decided to keep pushing it and see how much it is possible for me to milk the idea. So what makes sense is to make a list of mechanics so that I can feed them into the game one by one, and know what to set up with the level spaces to create expectations for the player. Number 1. The player can move and not move through walls. 2. The player must land on the finish square to finish each level, not before. 3. The player can swap places with yellow pips. 4. Yellow pips must be next to each other in pairs to progress. 5. Yellow pips can actually be in any amount as long as there are none on their own. 6. Yellow pips do not have to be frozen to win, they only have to be next to one another. 7. Reintroducing to the player that the finish square has to be the last thing you do to solve the puzzle. 8. Explore the ideas introduced in a puzzle. This is much easier and more fun to make as we have a list of stuff as sure things the player can do. 9. Deleting the one on the right because the mechanic explored in the room with 5 pips, along with how many needed together to work. This is better and less time wasty. All of these seem to like showing the player the machine more than exploring the machine. Final level. Hey look, you can actually do this tuck in 2 different ways. This one you could think to do, make the pips closer to the other pips. Another way that makes few extra turns that folds the pips nicely out of the way. Now I'm trying to work out a funny way to express this to the player. 2. I made a solution and it feels like it's too forced. Like the one solution, how to do it might have to be a trial and error. On the other hand, you can figure it out by looking at it and using the logic of what you learned from the beginning levels. I'm leaving it for now until I can playtest what I have done so far. For playtesting, I want them to be able to play while I'm not watching. I will take notes watching the gameplay back. And now the final section, which is a bit of wrap up and talk about the criteria. The main thing I keep thinking about when reviewing my main criteria is when I designed the mechanic, and by that I also mean the machine and the rules. It was much more of designing really open rules and open mechanics that would fit together nicely to be refined. I also had to think about the level design for some of the rules, otherwise I could have written anything on the paper and it would have looked good. From this I would change it from designing a machine to more specifically, designing an interesting set of rules that interact with a mechanic in a large variety of complex ways. So this was longer than I intended, so if you've made it to the end, please give me feedback on what was good and what was useful and what was interesting, as I will use this to try and cut the length drastically for the next episode. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, you can download the game, so please have a go at solving the first puzzles and let me know what you think of the design and everything. Finally, I hope you have a good day and I'll see you next time.